and welcome to Final Facts. My name is Alyssa, and like many of you, I have been exposed to the insensible, divisive rhetoric of Tomi Lahren over the last year. I have decided to create this segment in an attempt to break down Tomi's opinions as simply as possible in order to prove that few and far between are based on actual facts. With such a broad topic at hand, this pilot episode will focus on something both Tomi and I seem to care very much about, although for reasons on total opposite sides of the spectrum. Race, and more specifically, the existence of systematic oppression. We're going to take a look at a series of clips from Final Thoughts with Tomi. Following each clip, I have compiled respective responses based in actual research from credible sources, all of which are readily available for any of you to access through the Final Facts webpage. But before we begin, I'd like to bring anyone watching up to speed with a brief lesson in American history. Tomi's final thoughts, and truthfully, those with opinions similar to her own, have a habit of disregarding or altering entire pieces of this country's past, which have no doubt brought us to where we are today. So let's go over a few final facts surrounding American history that provide clear evidence towards the enduring presence of systematic oppression against African Americans. Let's start with the basics. Slavery began in 1619, America became a unified nation in 1776, and slavery ended technically when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified on December 6, 1865. So roughly 2.5 centuries of one race prospering and growing a nation off the enslavement of another race. Oh, but 1865? That was a century and a half ago. Yeah, we have had some divisiveness since then, civil rights and all, but everything is totally 100% solved now. Seems to be about the scope of Tomi's view. Her bandwagon of followers are quick to go along and skimming the surface of what brought the nation they are so patriotic for to where it is now. So let's go back to the timeline and try to take this deeper, but again, in the simplest terms. Jim Crow law came into play in 1877 and remained prevalent into the 1950s with the beginning of the civil rights movement. That's nearly 75 years of African Americans not being enslaved, sure, but instead now battling enforced racial segregation every day of their lives. But do we really understand the short and long-term effects of this period of racial segregation that ended not even 50 years ago? Let's talk about a few of the indisputable effects racial segregation had on African Americans. For the sake of time and its proximity to the present, I will be primarily focusing on historical events after 1900. Inequality in America, Race, Poverty, and Fulfilling Democracy's Promise by Stephen Caliendo is just one of many educational textbooks published in the last few years with an aim on accurately teaching American history. Published in 2014 by Westview Press, this textbook focuses on the realities surrounding inequality in America based on categories such as housing, education, hiring and employment, and healthcare. The following statistics used to examine the effects of racial segregation are taken from this source. Although the literacy level of African Americans was at 70% by the year 1910, they were continually and widely denied admission to attend colleges up into the 1950s, leading to the creation of historically black universities. At the same time, African Americans were continually and widely denied equal access to adequate housing up even further into the mid-60s. In fact, in 1933, a federal agency actually created maps which determined creditworthiness based partially on the race of residents. After the Federal Housing Association adopted these maps, reinforcing segregation became policy. So we've got African Americans now out of slavery, but technically still confined to a position lower than that of their white peers due to nearly a century of legal racial segregation. But what about after the Civil Rights Movement? MLK had a dream and then racism just totally ended with the passing of Civil Rights Acts up into the 1970s? Really? Why is it so hard for Tomi and her band of followers to understand that the civil rights movement brought about change, sure, but nowhere near enough to call this war a victory. The ending of slavery was the first winning battle to that war, which still, statistically, rages on today. Tommy's solution, though? Well, when you can't acknowledge that something actually exists, it's pretty hard to argue a logical solution. Let's take a look.
Where does the buck stop? When will those in black communities take a step back and take some responsibility for the problems in black communities? Because it seems to me blaming white people for all of your problems might make you the racist.
Tommy, do you know why many people of color, and here's a shocker, many white people like me, blame white people for the sufferings of black? Because it is a historically accurate statement to make. Maybe we are using hyperbole and it's confusing you, Tommy. No, we don't literally mean all white people today, right now, are to blame for the state of African American communities. We mean that, historically, the enslavement and then rampant discrimination against one specific race for the majority of this country's existence has very obviously put us in an unfairly divided spot. Still confused? Let's take a look at an article published in 2015 from U.S. News by Jeff Nesbitt that has provided a good number of modern statistics directly related to this claim. To keep things simple, I'm just going to rattle off a few of the most major statistics surrounding the economic and educational disadvantages uniquely surrounding African Americans still in modern day. The National Public Radio nonprofit media organization reported that African American children make up around 18% of the preschool population, but represent nearly half of all out-of-school suspensions. In grades K through 12, African American children become 3 times more likely than their white peers to be suspended. Only a fifth of disabled children are African American, but they account for almost half of the disabled students put in mechanical restraints or placed in seclusion. According to the American Psychological Association, African American juveniles are 18 times more likely to be sentenced as adults than white juveniles, and they make up almost 60% of children in prisons. Here's where it really starts kicking as far as economic impact. African American college graduates are twice as likely as their white peers to struggle to find a job. The jobless rate for African Americans has been double that of whites for decades. What was Tommy's solution again? Take responsibility? I wonder if she considers job hunting taking responsibility to try and better the community. Because guess what? African Americans have to actually put in more effort than their white peers in that department as well. Like pretty much everything else, but let's stick with employment since it is a key foundation for success. Tommy, did you know that the National Bureau of Economic Research found that individuals with black-sounding names had to send out 50% more job applications than people with white-sounding names just to get a callback? So essentially, having a name typically associated with the white race is equivalent to an additional 8 years of resume experience. But hey, we're all equal, right? Don't answer that yet, because there's more. The median net worth of white families is about $265,000, while the median from African American families sits at $28,500. Well, that makes sense, considering it's so much more difficult to actually get an interview. African American males are 3 times more likely to be searched at a traffic stop and 6 times more likely to go to jail than a white person. In fact, the Sentencing Project, released in August 2013, found that African Americans are not pulled over more because they are prone to criminal behavior, but rather because there is what they refer to as an implicit racial association of black Americans with dangerous or aggressive behavior. Even further, qualified African American jurors are illegally turned away up to 80% of the time in jury selection processes, and African Americans on average stay up to 20% longer in prison than whites who have committed the exact same crime. Is that your definition of equality in 2016, Tommy? Really? We all have equal rights? An attempt at actual research would clearly prove you wrong any day of the week. Let's take a look at another clip from Final Thoughts.
2. What is Trump going to do? Well, he's not going to pat you on the back and tell you setting fires and looting is your birthright. I'll tell you that much. Seriously, these are your communities too. Why are you setting them on fire? Does that make you feel better? The absence of leadership creates this kind of crap, and we've had a seismic lapse of leadership for almost 8 years now. The community organizer from Chicago couldn't make things better. He made it worse. Cities weren't burning 8 years ago, just saying.
Tommy, are you actually implying that there were no cities burning before the Obama presidency? I know how much you love to talk about protests, Tommy. Or, well, as you correct oftentimes, you love to talk about riots. Because to you, this isn't about the very tangible African-American plight of continuing discrimination. No. This is about African-Americans just shutting up and accepting their place in modern America because we got rid of slavery, so there's no conceivable way the aftermath of something that plagued our nation for nearly 3/4 of its existence could still be present just a short time later. But Tommy, I'm curious. Since you love riots so much, are you aware of who it was that actually started them in this country? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't your pals with a darker skin tone, that's for sure. Let's bring back that handy timeline to really put this into perspective, because I want to discuss just a handful of the major riots that happened during the era of Jim Crow law in the 1900s. Atlanta, Georgia, 1906. Hope Smith and Clark Howell were candidates for governor, and they used their campaigns to play on the white population's fears of a rising African-American middle class. 2 newspapers printed false allegations in September of African-American men assaulting 2 white women. An estimated 10,000 white men and boys rioted in the streets, beating any African-American male they could get their hands on. Anywhere from 25 to 100 African-Americans were killed, and hundreds more were injured. St. Louis, Missouri, 1917. Thousands of African Americans moved to East St. Louis during World War I seeking job opportunities. East St. Louis was another predominantly white city. On July 1st, an African American man was rumored to have killed a white man. Just this rumor alone led to anti-black violence, with whites shooting, beating, and lynching African Americans, as well as burning several of their homes to the ground. The violence lasted for a week, and an estimated 40 to 200 African Americans were killed. Additionally, upwards of 6,000 African Americans fled from East St. Louis. But Tommy, I thought you said cities weren't burning before the Obama administration. Or are you just forgetting that it was our ancestors who initiated actual riots 100 years ago? Also, did you notice my death and injury totals didn't mention any white Americans? Just so you know, I'm not leaving this information out. I didn't say any numbers because they don't exist. Because the white Americans who created this violence typically did not suffer any consequences for their actions, not in death, and certainly not in the public's perspective of labeling them as violent, like you always love to do towards black protesters in one all-encompassing swoop. But let's move on. The Red Summer, 1919. In this one summer alone, 26 riots erupted across the U.S. in cities like Washington, Knoxville, Longview, Phillips County, Omaha, and the most violent, Chicago. We will stick to that city for the sake of time. July 27, 1919. Are you familiar with that date? Because everyone should be. A 17-year-old African-American named Eugene Williams was attacked while swimming with his friends on this particular summer afternoon in Lake Michigan. A white attacker, along with a group of other whites, began throwing rocks at Williams and his friends for no apparent reason. One of these rocks hit Eugene Williams, and he subsequently drowned from the injury. When Eugene's friends and other African-American witnesses relayed the story to an officer, the white attacker was not arrested, and the officer actually refused to do anything further. Fighting began and escalated to the point of the state militia being deployed. The violence continued until August 3rd. An estimated 15 whites and 23 African Americans were killed. And an estimated 1,000 African Americans lost their homes to, you guessed it, arson. Moving on. Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. Hand in hand with overall access to education and overall access to housing, This one is especially important in terms of African American setbacks comparatively to what we can define even today as white privilege. The Greenwood section of Tulsa was the wealthiest African American community in the country. In May, Dick Rowland, an African American man, was promptly arrested and investigated for the crime of grabbing a white woman's arm in an elevator. Armed white men gathered, for no legitimate reason, outside the Tulsa County Courthouse where Rowland was being held. An armed group of African American men arrived to protect Rowland after it was discovered that the white woman's account of assault had been completely exaggerated. Shots were fired between the groups, but the African American Party immediately withdrew back to the Greenwood neighborhood. That should have been the end of it. An altercation happens, the African Americans respectfully left to avoid further conflict, but no. The armed whites actually followed them back to Greenwood, burning and looting buildings and homes. There are even reports of white Americans firing on Greenwood from planes. An estimated 1,250 African American homes were destroyed, and the Oklahoma National Guard instead imprisoned nearly 6,000 innocent African Americans. The most recent report, released in 2000 by the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, states that an estimated 300 deaths occurred. Many people familiar with the Tulsa riot know that it has been coined as the destruction of Black Wall Street. So Tommy, when was the last time the African American community has come together without reason to loot and burn the homes of over 1,000 innocent white folks, and then subsequently stand by freely as police arrested those same white folks? Tommy, what you love to forget is that African Americans protesting social injustices in 2016 have every reason to. One of my favorite quotes comes from John F. Kennedy, and it goes like this: "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Now, I'm not one for encouraging violence, but even I, as a white female who has grown up relatively middle class, can start to understand why some have grown violent after years of stagnant progress. Even I can take a step back and understand that there is an exhaustive list that grows every day of stuff I could do while interacting with police that would get my African American brother or sister shot dead in the streets. See, Tommy, you say that it's a lapse in leadership that has led to all of this rioting and violence, but I disagree. Now, I'm not one for encouraging violence, but even I, as a white female who has grown up relatively middle class, can start to understand why some have grown violent after years of stagnant progress. Even I can take a step back and understand that there is an exhaustive list that grows every day of stuff I could do while interacting with police that would get my African American brother or sister shot dead in the streets. See, Tommy, you say that it's a lapse in leadership that has led to all of this rioting and violence, but I disagree. My research strongly indicates that above all else, it seems that people like yourself, you and your droves of followers, are what is keeping this racial tension in motion. You see, this is what happens when an entire community of discriminated people rightfully stands up and asks for equal opportunity. And rather than the opposing community attempting to understand where they are coming from, you would rather just silence their oppression and tell them their experiences aren't real, almost as if their lives don't matter. Tommy, do you understand the term irony? Because it doesn't sound like it to me. About here's where I'm sure you would come chiming in with your usual smug, well, what rights do white Americans have that Black Americans don't? Oh, so you know what's technically legal and illegal, so you win by default? The situation couldn't possibly be more complicated than that. Is that right?
To make government bigger and give it more power. Do you realize how backwards your logic is? Enough. Get up, get dressed, get a job, make something of yourself. The world owes you nothing. You, by virtue of being born, do not get a trophy and a pass to act like a lawless thug. Your skin color does not give you that pass. Your neighborhood does not give you that pass. Your dedication to the bully Black Lives Matter movement does not give you that pass. There are hardworking Americans of every color who built the cities you're setting on.
Tommy, let me clarify a few things here. First, the definition of the word pass. in the sense that you are using it, means to get away with something. Are the African Americans acting like lawless thugs in your eyes, getting away with it without negative consequence? Because the last time I checked, they're still the ones dealing with inexcusable discrimination that would make anyone vulnerable to becoming rightfully violent. Let's take a look at just a few more examples of where systematic oppression is present still, today, just in case the ones we've already discussed haven't been enough. The housing boom saw a rise in home ownership for both minorities and white Americans, although still substantially more so for whites. The Great Recession widened this gap to 45% for African Americans and 74% for whites. And the foreclosure rate for African Americans who purchased homes from 2008 to 2009 is twice that of white Americans. In fact, in the 10th edition of Black Wealth, White Wealth, Melvin Oliver and Thomas Shapiro argue that inequality in family wealth is growing due to substandard schools located primarily in neighborhoods where minorities and low-income families heavily reside. And speaking of schools, proportions vary by state, but currently the federal government supplies around 10% of funding for K-12 public schools. The other 90% comes from statewide distributions and funding from local taxes. This is deepening inequality, as schools are essentially now only worth as much as the properties of the communities in which they are located. Here's my problem with equal opportunity. It can't actually exist when individuals are not given equal access to education. Research has proven over and over again that children from poor families do not have the same chance as children from wealthier families because of factors completely out of their control. Children from impoverished families often go to school hungry, which affects their performance. These same children face high levels of stress from living in dangerous neighborhoods or dealing with overly stressed or even abusive parents or family members. It's hard to imagine how a child with parents who can't be around as much to help with schoolwork because they have to work constantly just to survive can have the same opportunity as a child with a parent who can be home every night or could afford education or additional tutoring outside of the public school environment that certainly doesn't cater to different learning abilities. General social survey data confirms that finishing high school is largely dependent on socioeconomics and family history. This data found that children whose fathers did not graduate are 8 times more likely not to graduate themselves. Researchers Pedro Nogueira and Antoine Acon have reported that a desire for peer acceptance combined with racial images rooted in stereotypes diminish the importance of intellectual pursuits among young minority students. Additionally, while such stereotypes may not diminish one's pursuit of education, it can certainly make the path to success much more difficult than those not battling discrimination daily. Obviously, from the title, I like to stick to the facts, but I can't ignore how much truth an individual experiencing the fallout of such information can provide. So take it with a grain of salt if you absolutely must. But I personally find it logical to have someone who has felt the effects of discrimination on a daily basis share their experience on this segment. So please welcome Jericho Sorrells.
Hi, I'm Jericho Sorrells. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to give you a brief history.
Tell me a little bit about how you think the idea of getting the people of color into the religion, into Christianity, led to this physical enslavement turning into a mental entrapment.
They use that to keep them, in check. And so they just kept working, hoping maybe one day we'll be delivered from this, kind of like the Moses in the Egypt. And they just, well, it's just like the Moses in Egypt story. It's time from God, goes and frees his people. I think that they just decided, hey, if we just keep working at this and serving our masters, then eventually someone will come and free us. Fast forward to Abraham Lincoln. Then you have the Emancipation Proclamation, and he tries to free the slaves. Civil War breaks out, North versus South. Obviously, South loses. And they free the slaves. Now they're like, we don't have a physical hold on them anymore. Let's see, we could always tarnish their image. So they start keeping them out of areas they've designated as whites only. They make colored areas only, keeping all the people of color separated from the rest of the population. And it really alienates them and makes them think, hey, we're not really a part of this country. There's nothing that we're doing here. Nothing's going on.
So now what would you say, because clearly, as many would argue, obviously many people argue we all have the same rights now. We're not dealing with, obviously, technically like legal segregation now. So what is it now that you feel like, because there's obviously still an issue here, so what are some things, like walk us through, that you feel like that are happening in modern day, that kind of everything that you just discussed that really brought us to where we are now?
Oof. Let's talk about hip-hop music. Hip-hop music has been, or hip-hop and rap music have been dubbed as hoodlum, gangster, trash, garbage, all that, to make you think that there aren't any positive messages behind it, and that all they talk about is money, drugs, and sex all the time. When really there are stories in there about, say, oppression, how the government has really kept us behind in a way. It's like they give opportunities here to this certain group. This certain group may get opportunities, but they won't necessarily be as good as this group. So you have a lot of narrative on that in hip-hop and rap music, but that doesn't really make the surface, like the stuff that sells, like the money, the drugs, and the sex that gets talked about a lot in hip-hop. So there's also been a lot of shadow put on to the music in the community of the people of color as well.
Can you give us a little insight on just some things that you've experienced personally, and maybe how, you know, again, we don't deal with legal segregation, but this whole idea of, like, with the hip-hop music and notions like that, it kind of builds, and how that can affect a person of color mentally, and then it affect their experience going forward from that. So do you have any kind of personal experiences like that you could share?
Ooh. Being called a token black guy, that gets me every time. I used to skate at this skating rink called Skate Around. It's called Fun Galaxy, now it's in Athens, Georgia. I used to work there, and they would always take us out on these employee-like lunches and whatnot, but they always made jokes about me being the token black guy, because apparently you always have to have one. And apparently, I've learned that gives you like free reign to say the N-word for some reason. I'm not sure where that comes from. And I always felt really weird going out with them, because it was just me, the only person of color. They were, they're really, like, I want to say rural than a lot of people that I've met. And so I guess they didn't understand a lot of things that would have made me feel uncomfortable, because they never had to deal with it. But things like, there's the token black guy thing. There's, for some reason, always like a menagerie of race jokes being made, as if those are all cool, as if any other race would be fine sitting in this group joking back and forth. You make a joke back, then they start getting uncomfortable, and you're like, whoa, but you just said,
yeah.
Well, it's not the same thing, but it is exactly the same thing. Like, one joke about, was it like the priest, the Jew, and the rabbi going to a bar or whatever, kind of jokes like that, and no, nobody finds these funny. They laugh because they're uncomfortable.
Right.
They don't really want you to think that there's a problem there. Like, they don't want to protest or anything. Like, they don't want to say anything to make you feel bad. So, they still want to be friends with you, but.
And the problem is, for you as the only person there, like, it kind of puts you in a spot, like, do you want to say something, or am I going to seem like the person that can't take a joke? But I don't think, we obviously know how to take jokes. We laugh at memes all day long, It's just, we just want jokes that are a little more clean and not so offensive. But, I think there's some naysayers who might come forward and be like, oh, well, it's just a joke. blah, 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 that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. That's not holding people back. But really, it just adds to, normalizing those type of ideas. Anything you could tell us about maybe just how growing up in that type of environment can kind of shape how you would view yourself, and in that, like how that impacts you being able to move forward with your life?
Mm. Growing up, I went to a Christian school, Athens Christian School, and there were, I wanted, good 6 black people there, including myself and my 2 sisters. I switched over to public school in 5th grade.
Culture shock.
Yeah, I was completely mind blown. Things I'd never seen before. It's like, wow, untucked shirts. And it was a completely different side of the spectrum. Here you had prim and proper. Over here you had slightly unruly, but I still felt comfortable there a little bit. But in my mind, I still thought I didn't fit in because I didn't grow up around all these people. I didn't know how things work in this type of community.
It's almost like people of color have to deal with this totally unique identity crisis. Because on the one hand, you have, people, if they've grown up around, in an environment around like just nothing but people of color, you have that. But on the other hand, you have someone like you, who now you're feeling like you don't fit in either way, because I'm sure maybe you got maybe like you were saying, you have like the token black guy. So by that, and maybe on growing up in a culture where it was just mostly, white, that maybe you get that like Uncle Tom idea type thrown around too, yeah. Which is, again, it's like a double-edged sword. Like no matter what you do, you know what I mean?
No matter what I do, it's like I can't please this side, I can't please that side, so I have to walk the middle ground, and it's hard because you have this group of friends over here that you have, and you have a group of friends over here that you have, and you don't really want them to meet because
it's just gonna clash. It's not gonna work.
No, to either side would.
So it's like you almost have to be a totally different person around both groups, and I feel like that's not really something that people on my side of the spectrum really ever have to. We can just be ourselves and do whatever, and we don't have to worry. One thing that really bugs me, and I'm sure you probably recognize this too, is how I feel like people of color just aren't really allowed to have emotions like we are, because I can sit here and be angry and and give my opinion, but the second a woman of color wants to come forward and rightfully be angry about something, she's automatically labeled the crazy black girl or whatever.
Black girl.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's a very terrible double standard. And what is there anything else that you think that you could share on that?
Trying to walk through quicksand.
Mm-hmm. It seems something that I've been thinking recently is I just feel like we've gotten at the point where, yes, we can recognize that a lot of progress has been made since, the civil rights movement, but I feel like that was just one, battle in this long war that we are still fighting. And I think we're at this point now with how everything's going on that we cannot be, we can't be neutral. Like, we cannot be passive at this point. To me, it feels like if you're being passive, then you're also part of the problem. Because the only way that we're going to be able to move forward and change, the one thing that's left is changing these stereotypes and these ideas that have been normalized into our culture. We have to make them so those are not the normal ideas. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jericho. We really appreciate having you on here, and thanks for sharing your experience. And now, moving on to the Fast Fact Recap and final 5 questions. So I'd like to wrap this up with a few questions specifically for Tommy. This might be pointless though, since her recent bit with Trevor Noah on The Daily Show has proven how much she loves avoiding the real questions. Number 1. Tommy, I'd like to reiterate Trevor Noah's inquiry right off the bat, since we all know you never legitimately answered it. If a person of color has a grievance, how can they express this? We know they can't talk about it because then they're crybabies. We know they can't protest in the streets because then they're thugs, or just playing the victim. And we know they can't silently sit or kneel during the anthem because then they're being disrespectful. So again, I ask you, Tommy, how can they express their struggles? You see, the funny thing is when you refuse to give an answer for that question, the majority of us are left rightfully thinking this is because your actual answer would consist of black people just sitting back, shutting up, and accepting their systematically lesser place in America. Number 2, Tommy, you frequently perpetuate the idea that if police brutality were real, then we would witness actual convictions of officers when the unproportioned deaths of Black Americans are clearly on their hands. I think it had something to do with your overly patriotic narrative that could never possibly find our justice system at fault in such cases. But wait, aren't you the same chick that whined for months on end about Hillary never getting a conviction over her emails? So my question becomes, how is it that the same justice system that wouldn't convict Hillary somehow magically becomes unbiased and perfect enough to rightfully convict cases in relation to police brutality? Number 3, tell me, if you were paying attention to the facts presented here, and if you have the mental capacity to actually do your own research, how in the world can you literally believe that the oppression of Black America is perceived? I guess because Kaepernick is a wealthy athlete with white parents, he can never experience systematic oppression nor fight against it? Is that really why his protest doesn't hold up in your eyes? Oh, and while I'm on the topic, a sub-question for these questions. Kaepernick announced this year that he would be donating $1 million of what he makes this season to charities that assist communities affected by racial injustice and police brutality. I'm curious, Tommy, since you really aren't racist, and you additionally claim to care about America, when was the last time you donated $1 million to those struggling the most in this country you love so much? Or is it hard to be charitable when your only source of income is from spewing uneducated trash atop your throne of white feminism and white superiority? Number 4, Tommy, please, I'm dumbfounded over your ignorant rhetoric that pins the left's narrative in a corner for claiming exhaustive tolerance, yet being intolerant to conservative viewpoints. Let me attempt to put this simply so you can maybe finally understand where the left is coming from. Conservative ideologies are based in traditionalism. Tradition literally means to keep things the same way, to keep with tradition. So when people like you say, oh, we both want X, Y, or Z, we just disagree on the steps to getting there. No. Conservatism, keeping things the same, will never bring about the rapid progress that makes actual change a reality. And look, here's the thing, because I know more than most that this isn't always black and white, but there is a line that when crossed, turns left versus right into right versus wrong. Donald Trump was that line. You believing and perpetuating the notion that systematic oppression against people of color is perceived and not a tangible thing is that line. You cannot just pick and choose beliefs rooted in racism, sexism, and hate, and then toss aside the worst ones like some sort of alt-right buffet. Yeah, I used alt-right, and no, it is not a term I am applying here simply because you disagree with me. I can live with and even love others who don't agree with me on everything. But again, there is a line. There are deal breakers. Tommy, when you use your platform of influence to dismiss those standing up for justice, you disillusion your audience even further into thinking their alt-right-esque principles are normal. You disillusion your cult of followers and anyone with your view into thinking that their hateful behaviors and attitudes are okay in America. Yes, I know this is a free country, and whoever can believe whatever they want. But I think that freedom needs to come to a halt when the result of it is nothing short of life-threatening to entire groups of people. Tell me you can cry all day long that you aren't racist, but I wonder if you have ever given thought to how actual racists would receive your show and your rhetoric. When a racist witnesses something like you literally saying that the systematic oppression of Black Americans doesn't exist, what do you think their reaction is? I bet you the $1 million Kaepernick donated that the racist viewer is completely reassured in their white supremacist beliefs. Tommy, the last question is actually rhetorical. With all the anger and misinformation you put into the world on a daily basis, how can you honestly sleep at night? This has been Final Facts with Alyssa. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep fighting the good fight, keep standing up against injustices, and keep your heads held high. The louder we are together, the harder it will be to ignore us apart. Good night.